The bright light that you see at the top is the American Airlines Jet as it approached the runway. Then you see the helicopter flying directly into the frame and directly into the plane. Both aircraft immediately then crashing down into the Potomac River. The second video, it appears to be surveillance video from the airport and showing the very same helicopter moving along the river as the plane approaches the runway at DCA, and then the collision and the explosion and into the Potomac River.
Welcome to this deep dive. And, it's a heavy one.
Yeah.
We're looking into that plane crash near Washington, D.C. that happened just a couple days ago.
Right.
January 29th.
Mm-hmm.
No survivors.
Yeah.
I know it's a lot to process. And honestly, prepping for this, I felt the weight of it myself.
It's one of those events that, just reminds us how fragile things are.
Absolutely.
And when it comes to aviation, the margin for error is so incredibly slim.
Yeah. So what we're trying to do here is piece together what happened. We've got news reports from, major outlets like CNN, ABC, Reuters, which give us the overview.
Sure.
Then we've got some expert analysis from people like Captain Byron Bailey who could break down the technical aspects.
Right.
And this is always tough to hear, but we'll also be going through some of the air traffic control audio.
Yeah, it's often those primary sources, like the audio that really bring home the reality of this situation.
Right. It's easy to get lost in the reports and the analysis, but those voices, they ground us in the human element of this tragedy. So let's start with the basics. It was Wednesday evening, American Airlines Flight 5342, a CRJ 700, 64 people on board, getting ready to land at Reagan National Airport, runway 33. To be precise.
At the same time, we have a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter call sign Pat 25 with 3 crew members.
All right.
They're doing a training mission in the same airspace.
And I think everyone's seen that security footage by now, the one from the Kennedy Center.
Chilling, isn't it? To see that helicopter just a speck against the night sky, hitting straight toward that plane, and then that flash.
And the wreckage ended up in the Potomac.
Yeah.
Imagine those rescue teams diving into near-freezing water.
Yeah.
Trying to find, hoping to find survivors, I guess.
Conditions were brutal. Visibility was almost zero. The current was strong. And there were even ice flows in the water.
Wow.
An incredibly difficult and dangerous operation.
And tragically, as we said, no survivors.
Yeah.
67 lives lost.
Yeah.
64 passengers on that plane. 3 crew members in the helicopter. Among those passengers, there was a group of young figure skaters returning from a national competition.
Yeah. Right.
2 world champion Russian figure skaters. Evgenia Shishkova and Vadim Naumov, a married couple.
Yeah.
It's just hard to fathom the scope of the loss.
And that's exactly why we do this, right?
Yeah.
To try to make sense of these tragedies, to honor the memory of those lost by understanding what happened.
Okay, so let's get into the flight paths and the communication leading up to the impact.
So both aircrafts were flying along the Potomac River.
Okay.
That seems to be a common thread here.
Yeah.
The plane was approaching the airport from the south while the helicopter was traveling perpendicular to it.
Right.
Also following the river.
And from the air traffic control recordings, we hear the controller noticing a potential problem, asking the helicopter crew, Pat 25, do you have the CRJ in sight?
The helicopter responded affirmative, and the controller instructed them to pass behind the CRJ. But seconds later, the collision.
So many questions immediately come up. Why didn't the helicopter follow those instructions? Why was there a collision even after the controller intervened?
That's what we're diving into, right? And as with most aviation accidents, there isn't a single easy answer. We're talking about a chain of events, multiple factors potentially contributing to the tragedy.
Okay, let's unpack some of those factors, starting with the helicopter's altitude. Several sources, including aviation expert Byron Bailey, who analyzed the radar data, point out that the helicopter was flying way above its permitted altitude of 200 feet.
Bailey's analysis puts the helicopter at 350 feet right before the collision, while the plane was at 400 feet on its final approach.
Oh.
That unauthorized altitude is a major red flag.
Another concern is the helicopter's ADF-B transponder.
Right.
The device that broadcasts its location to other aircraft and air traffic control.
And it seems that this transponder wasn't transmitting, meaning the plane wouldn't have received those electronic alerts about the helicopter's position.
Right.
The big question is, why was it off during a routine training flight? That's not standard procedure.
I'm also seeing reports suggesting the helicopter pilot might have misidentified the incoming CRJ 700, mistaking it for another aircraft. Is that even possible?
It's definitely something investigators will be looking into, especially given the challenging conditions of a night flight. Combine that potential misidentification with the altitude discrepancy and the lack of transponder data, and you've got a recipe for disaster.
And to add another layer of complexity, we learned there was only one air traffic controller managing both planes and helicopters at the time.
Now, that's not necessarily a violation of protocol, but it's certainly not ideal.
Right.
It raises questions about workload and whether a single controller could effectively manage such a congested airspace, especially considering the mix of visual and instrument flight rules.
Hold on.
Yeah.
You just brought up VFR and IFR. Could you quickly explain that for our listeners who might not be familiar with those terms?
Of course, VFR stands for visual flight rules, meaning the pilot relies primarily on what they can see to maintain safe distances from other aircraft.
Okay.
IFR, on the other hand, is instrument flight rules, where the pilot relies on instruments and guidance from air traffic control.
Right.
In this case, the plane was operating under IFR, which gives it priority, while the helicopter was under VFR.
Got it. Thanks for clarifying. So we have a complex picture emerging. Multiple factors that could have contributed to this tragedy. Where do we go from here? What happens next?
Well, both the NTSB and the Department of Defense have launched investigations. The black boxes from both aircraft have been recovered, which is crucial for understanding the events leading up to the crash.
But this isn't just a technical investigation. It's a human story. A story of loss and grief, and we need to acknowledge that.
Absolutely. We can't lose sight of the human cost of this tragedy. 67 lives lost, families shattered, a community in mourning.
And unfortunately, the investigation has already become somewhat politicized. President Trump made some early statements blaming the helicopter pilots, air traffic controllers, and even suggesting that DEI policies within the FAA might have played a role.
It's important to note that those statements haven't been substantiated by the evidence presented in the sources we have. Meanwhile, other officials like Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy are urging everyone to wait for a thorough investigation before pointing fingers. Duffy has said that the crash was absolutely preventable, but it's simply too early to draw definitive conclusions.
That seems like the most responsible approach. So with multiple investigations underway, what are the next steps?
The NTSB is expected to release a preliminary report within 30 days, offering initial findings based on the black box data and other evidence, but a comprehensive final report could take months or even years to complete.
We're talking about a long road ahead, a complex process of piecing together what happened.
Yeah.
And ultimately, as you said, it's about understanding it, about preventing future tragedies, about honoring those who were lost.
Exactly. These investigations aren't just about finding fault. They're about learning from mistakes, improving safety protocols, and ultimately protecting lives.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. The scene, the flight paths, the communication, potential contributing factors, and the ongoing investigations. It's clear that this wasn't just one thing going wrong, but a confluence of events that led to this horrible collision. Altitude issues the transponder problem, potential misidentification, and perhaps even workload concerns for the air traffic controller.
You're right. Aviation accidents are rarely caused by a single isolated event. It's usually a chain of events, a domino effect that leads to tragedy.
It's both fascinating and heartbreaking. It underscores the need for a system-wide approach to aviation safety. We need to constantly evaluate and improve every aspect. Pilot training, air traffic control procedures, aircraft technology.
Absolutely. We need to be vigilant, proactive, and constantly striving to create a safer airspace.
Right.
But even then, with all the safeguards in place, the human factor remains.
That's a powerful point. And speaking of the human factor, let's shift our focus to the helicopter's flight path and its deviation from the approved altitude. What can you tell us about that?
Well, that's where things get particularly interesting. We know Pat 25 was on training flight, but the sources provide limited details about the specific mission that night.
Yeah.
And that's one of the key questions we need to address. What were they doing? Why were they flying so high?
Okay, let's dive into that in part 2. Stay with us as we continue this deep dive.
So picking up where we left off, you're right, the helicopter's flight path is a real puzzle. It was a training flight, but the specifics are murky. What were they doing up there? Were they practicing high-altitude maneuvers? Were they simulating an emergency? Was there a miscommunication about their clearance? These are the questions investigators will be digging into.
It's strange, isn't it? You'd think for a training flight, especially in such a busy airspace, they'd stick to a pretty strict plan.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But remember, we're dealing with the military here.
Right.
Their training protocols can be different, sometimes more flexible to simulate real-world scenarios.
I see what you mean. But even with that flexibility, 150 feet above the permitted altitude is a significant deviation. I mean, it's not like they were just a little bit off course.
Exactly, and that's what makes this so perplexing. Captain Bailey, the aviation expert we mentioned earlier, was adamant that the altitude deviation couldn't be explained away by a simple mistake. He even said, and I'm quoting here, this wasn't a case of, oops, we climbed a little too high. This was a deliberate decision to operate outside of their authorized airspace.
Wow, that's a strong statement.
It is, and it suggests that this wasn't just a lapse in judgment, but potentially something more systemic. Were they pushing the boundaries during this training exercise? Was there undue pressure to perform? These are all possibilities that investigators will need to explore.
Okay, so let's say, for argument's sake, that the altitude deviation was intentional part of the training scenario. Wouldn't they have informed air traffic control? Wouldn't there be some kind of record of this?
That's the logical assumption, but again, we're dealing with the military. They have different protocols, different chains of command. It's entirely possible that the air traffic controllers handling civilian aircraft weren't fully briefed on the details of this particular military training exercise.
That's unsettling, to say the least. It raises questions about coordination and communication between civilian and military airspace. You'd think in a place like Washington, D.C., with all its sensitive airspace, the communication would be airtight.
You'd hope so. And that's undoubtedly something investigators will be scrutinizing. Was there a breakdown in communication? Were there assumptions made that shouldn't have been made?
Okay, so we've got this altitude mystery, and then we've got the issue of the deactivated transponder. It's like these two huge question marks hanging over the entire investigation.
It's almost as if we're dealing with two separate incidents that tragically converged at the same point in time and space. On the one hand, you have this altitude deviation, and on the other hand, you have this transponder issue. Either one of these on their own could have been a serious safety concern, but together they created a perfect storm.
You know, when you explain it like that, it makes it even harder to grasp. It's like, how could so many things go wrong at the same time?
That's the nature of complex systems, unfortunately. Aviation in particular is built on layers upon layers of safety protocols, redundancy, and backups. But when multiple failures align, even the most robust system can be overwhelmed.
So let's talk about that transponder. You mentioned earlier that the military has the authority to turn off transponders for specific reasons, but this wasn't a sensitive mission. It was a training flight.
Right. And none of the public flight tracking websites picked up any ADS-B data from the helicopter?
Wait, back up a second. What ISS ADS-B? I know it has something to do with the transponder, but can you break it down for those of us who aren't aviation experts?
Sure thing. Imagine it like this. ADS-B is basically a GPS for planes. It's a system where the aircraft broadcasts its precise location, altitude, and speed to other aircraft and to air traffic control. It's a huge leap forward in safety because it allows everyone to see where everyone else is in the sky, even in conditions with limited visibility.
Okay, that makes sense. So the helicopter's ADS-B was off, which means
that the plane's collision avoidance system, known as TCSS, was essentially blind to the helicopter's presence. TCSS relies on that ADS-B data to detect potential conflicts and alert the pilots.
So if the helicopter's ADS-B had been active, the plane's TCSS would have sounded the alarm, giving the pilots time to react.
Most likely, yes. But there's a nuance here. TCS is designed to deactivate below 1,000 feet to prevent pilots from receiving false alarms and potentially descending into the ground.
Hold on, so even if the helicopter's transponder had been working, the plane's TCS might not have picked it up because they were both below 1,000 feet.
That's a crucial point, and it adds another layer of complexity to this already tangled web. We're talking about multiple systems, multiple safeguards, all interacting in ways that are difficult to predict.
It's enough to make your head spin, but we need to keep untangling this web right. For the families of those who were lost, for the sake of preventing something like this from ever happening again.
You're absolutely right. And that brings us to another piece of this puzzle, the air traffic controller. We learned that one controller was managing both planes and helicopters that night. Now, our sources say that while this isn't unusual, it's not the preferred scenario, especially during busy periods. One report even called it not normal.
So could this have been a factor? Was the controller overwhelmed?
It's something investigators will be looking into, for sure. There have been concerns about air traffic controller shortages in recent years, and that can lead to increased workloads and fatigue, which can absolutely compromise safety.
Imagine the pressure that controller must have been under. Trying to manage all that traffic, dealing with different types of aircraft, different flight rules, all while maintaining constant vigilance. It's a high-stakes job, to say the least.
Absolutely. And we know from the audio recordings that the controller did alert the helicopter to the approaching plane and instructed them to pass behind it.
But those instructions weren't followed. So was it a miscommunication? Did the helicopter pilots misinterpret the instructions? Or was it a deliberate decision to deviate from the controller's guidance?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it gets to the heart of the human factor in aviation. We can have all the technology, all the procedures, all the safeguards in the world, but ultimately it comes down to human decisions, human actions, human reactions.
And those human factors are the most difficult to understand, to predict, to control.
They are, and that's why investigations like this are so important. They force us to confront the limits of our systems, the limits of our understanding, and ultimately the limits of human fallibility.
It's a sobering thought. We like to think of aviation as this highly controlled, highly predictable environment. But this tragedy reminds us that even with all our technology and expertise, there's always an element of risk, an element of the unknown.
And that's why we do what we do right. To learn from these tragedies, to improve our systems, to honor those who are lost by striving for a safer future.
Well said. Let's shift gears now and talk about the immediate aftermath of the crash, the response from authorities, the search and rescue efforts, the recovery operation. It must have been chaotic and heartbreaking.
It was. But amidst the chaos, there was also incredible courage and dedication. Let's talk about that in part 3.
It's hard to even imagine what it must have been like at that crash site. You know, those first responders, the divers, the Coast Guard, working in those conditions, knowing the odds.
It's a testament to their training and their dedication. You know, the sources describe a truly heroic effort. First responders arrived within minutes.
Wow.
And the search and rescue operation swung into action immediately, despite the frigid water near zero visibility and the strong currents.
The Potomac River in January? That's got to be bone-chillingly cold.
Absolutely. And the wreckage was scattered across a wide area, making the search even more difficult. Divers from the D.C. Fire Department, along with Coast Guard units and other agencies, they worked tirelessly, hoping against hope that they might find someone alive.
But as we know, there were no survivors. At some point, the mission shifted from rescue to recovery. That must have been a heavy weight to bear.
It was. But even then, the commitment of those teams was unwavering. They continued to work around the clock, recovering victims and debris, meticulously documenting every piece of the wreckage.
And while that recovery operation was unfolding, the investigations were getting underway. The NTSB, the primary investigative body, moved quickly, right?
They did. A team of experts was dispatched to the scene almost immediately. They secured the wreckage, recovered the black boxes, and began the painstaking process of piecing together what happened.
It's almost like an archaeological dig, isn't it? Sifting through the debris, looking for clues, trying to reconstruct the events that led to this tragedy.
It is. And in this case, the black boxes are crucial. They hold the key to understanding what happened in those final moments.
Yeah.
The cockpit voice recorder captures conversations between the pilots and air traffic control, and the flight data recorder provides a wealth of information about the aircraft's altitude, speed, and maneuvers.
So what are investigators hoping to learn from these black boxes? What are the big questions they're trying to answer?
They're looking for any indication of what the pilots were doing, why they were flying so high, and whether they responded appropriately to the air traffic controller's instructions. They'll also be analyzing the aircraft's performance, looking for any signs of mechanical problems or malfunctions.
It's fascinating in a morbid way how much information can be gleaned from these black boxes. They're like a time machine, taking us back to those final moments, helping us understand what went wrong.
It's incredible technology, really.
Yeah.
But the black boxes are just one piece of the puzzle. Investigators will also be analyzing radar data wreckage patterns and eyewitness accounts.
Speaking of eyewitness accounts, what are people saying? What did they see?
There are numerous accounts from people who witnessed the collision. Some saw the flash of light, others heard the explosion, some described debris falling into the Potomac, and many understandably expressed shock and horror at what they had witnessed.
It's hard to even imagine seeing something like that. It must have been terrifying.
It was. And these eyewitness accounts, while often subjective, can be incredibly valuable to investigators. They can help corroborate other evidence, fill in gaps in the timeline, and provide a more complete picture of what happened.
Okay, so we've got the black boxes, the radar data, the wreckage, the eyewitness accounts. Investigators are pulling all these pieces together, trying to make sense of this tragedy. But ultimately, it all comes down to answering one question: could this crash have been prevented?
That's the question that drives every aviation investigation, and it's a complex question with no easy answers. But that's why we do this right, to learn from our mistakes, to identify areas for improvement to make the skies safer for everyone.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's about learning. It's about improving. It's about honoring the memory of those we lost by striving for a safer future. And as we wrap up this deep dive, that's the message I want to leave our listeners with.
I agree. This tragedy was a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of safety in aviation. We owe it to the victims, to their families, and to ourselves to never stop learning, never stop questioning, and never stop pushing for a safer airspace.
Thank you for joining us on this difficult journey, and to our listeners, thank you for listening.